Five, four, three, two, one.
Hi, everybody, and welcome to the Jon Myer podcast. Now, our topic today is reducing your FinOps payback period, which is a very interesting topic. And before we get to that, how about we give our guests a moment to introduce themselves?
Hi, John. Thanks for having us. My name is Steve Robinson, CEO of Hyperglance. Hyperglance is a full suite cloud management platform, inclusive of FinOps, cloud security and compliance. We like to say we're the FinOps tool for cloud architects. So we are found in Fortune 500, Department of Defense, and public sector customer sets. And we're unique in terms of our deployment model, in terms of actually not being SaaS. We're kind of locally deployed, which also helps in terms of our adoption and penetration in the market.
Easier for compliance reasons as well with locally deployed.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's a very important kind of characteristic of our product in terms of how we get through that InfoSec check fast lane and get into deployments and value.
Steve, let's talk about FinOps, right? Before we talk about the payback period, because when you approach me with this topic, I'm like, there's a payback period. That's actually very interesting that there should be, and nobody actually talks about that. But I want to talk about FinOps. What is FinOps really?
FinOps, when you think about it, it's a new term for an old discipline, right? It's monitoring the spend on your cloud, obviously, but what it needs to be is a collaboration between your financial domain and your technical domain, and creating clear organizational channels of communication is a key to a clear and well-established FinOps organization.
One of the challenges with FinOps is the traditional model, the siloed architecture, not new cloud, born in the cloud or anything, because they understand the collaboration, is that finance typically controlled what budget you had, what you were purchasing. That's no longer the case anymore with FinOps and actually cloud in general, because you're spinning up services, you're utilizing it as an engineer, and finance has no freaking clue what you're doing.
Right. And so, we talk about shadow IT. We talk about cloud sprawl. We talk about, over provisioning and things of this nature. All those things are not necessarily, bad intentions out there, right? It's, again, back to that channel of communication between the finance arm and the cloud engineering arm is what needs to happen to bridge those conversations. Automation is a key component to a FinOps, successful FinOps model as well, but you can over-engineer and over-automate things too. You've got to have the right understanding, contextual understanding of the architecture and how that fits into application and user experience, and how that relates to the actual cost that's driven out over time.
Before we talk about our topic, the FinOps payback period, I want to understand the implementation of FinOps. And usually, I want to say like the length of time it takes to implement it for a company that doesn't understand fully what it is and how to implement it.
Right. So like any transformational change or even, small change, it requires executive stakeholdering, right? So you've got to have people at the top that understand the objective of cost containment. I mean, the CFO understands that. The CTO, the CIO also clearly understand that, but they have other charters too. They've got to keep those apps and applications or apps and databases running. They got to keep everything visible, particularly for mission critical apps. So again, I'm back to, there's a cultural element to this in terms of getting that bridged conversation flowing, and not just ad hoc, not just I need this report, or can you give me this kind of dashboard or whatnot. It's a deeper conversation over time. Most companies are growing at a roughly 20% year-on-year growth in their cloud spend. So it's a net effect. It's not a one and done, let's drive cost out, let's all go home, right? Let's go have a cocktail. It's more about over time, how do we actively manage these environments, and how do we bridge that communication path so that there's meaningful, sustainable understanding and context for the spend that's happening.
Steve, is there really a way to put and quantify how much it takes to put or implement FinOps culture within an organization? Because, and I'm going to give you a chance to answer that, but I want to talk about enterprise companies, because if you talk about small startups or cloud, that's a little bit easier to implement. Enterprises is really where it takes a little bit of time to get this culture implemented. What is the length of time it takes to implement it?
Well, I mean, it varies. We have customers that have very mature FinOps models, global models, in fact, around their cloud spend. Others are kind of just finding the door in terms of what's my inventory that I have out there. You can't really necessarily get a good, clear visualization of inventory from invoicing, right? Over time, that represents millions of line items, and you can get lost in that and very easily. So first, you start with what's the level of where they at today, right? It may not be zero. It may be something where they do have some reporting, they do have some communication channels going, but we've got to really understand where they're at. I'd say on average, it's minimally 6 months, more like a year, before you really get an institutionalized or workflow level type of adoption around the kind of the best practices of FinOps. And that's also contextual in terms of what is a best practice. It depends on the vertical you're in. It depends on your architecture. It depends on your journey to cloud to begin with in terms of what good looks like around that.
The reason I ask how long it takes to implement it, because it goes into our topic, the payback period. Let's just take the assumption that it takes a year to implement it. What does it mean with the FinOps payback period?
Yeah, so there's two pieces to that. The first are hard cost savings, right? Do I have cloud sprawl or shadow IT? I'm spending on elements of cloud that I shouldn't be. I'm not getting any utility out of the spend that I have out there. And that can be one-time assessment, but typically it's one-time plus rolling assessments around, do I have any wastage out there? So those are hard costs that you can find. Then there's the next tier up is architectural consideration. Are we optimized in terms of our architecture? Do we have an old, outdated architecture? Did we have to refactor an app from the premise, a legacy app, and go into the cloud? Did we do that right? Maybe, maybe not. And you need to take a look at that potentially. Or is it cloud native architecture? And really, it could be adopted from a kind of a VM architecture into more of a K8 or Kubernetes context or serverless. So there's a lot of, consideration that can go around that. The third layer is more around planning. And how do I think about my cloud spend in terms of today and tomorrow and how it evolves over time? And yes, you can do variance against budget. That's a very common thing to do. But I mean more meaningfully in terms of what my overarching user demand points are around my cloud spend, right? Outside in. And then what am I going to look at in terms of efficiencies, right? And optimizations as I ramp up that capacity or those new workloads that are going to go into the cloud.
When we're talking about reducing the payback period, I don't think anybody's ever brought that topic to me or looked at it from that point, because you're trying to implement FinOps within your company. You're trying to do the culture. And everybody knows that doing a cultural shift in an enterprise company does not happen overnight.
Right.
You can't do this. You have pushback. You have people who have been there forever and they're like, I ain't doing that. I ain't doing that. But that process takes you 6-8 months and it's still a pushback process. No, I don't want to do this. I don't think they kind of looked at reducing that period. Mm-hmm. Some of the things you just mentioned, are those ways to reduce it that they should be looking at, or why should I reduce it? I mean, what is the benefit to me as a company?
Right. Well, I mean, there are hard ROI dollars in that in terms of your spend, right? But it's more than that, right? It should always be kind of encased in what's the business context for what we do and don't do around the cloud, right? And the value to end users and the value to the market and your customers, most importantly, right? So if you have an organization, let's say a large organization that's looking inward, a finance organization and a cloud organization that are looking at each other, what they need to do is look at the customer, right? What does the customer need? Let's not look at each other and say, I need cost down, I need this app up 24/7. Right, and that friction point.
That's such a contract that like they go against each other. Right. I need it all the time, but you got to reduce the cost. Right. Engineers only really care about the SLA, building new stuff, and reducing is not top of priority for them.
So if they take their context away from each other and look at the customer and what does the customer need and drive back into their conversation with that perspective, then the friction gets kind of smoothed out a little bit. And they can also look at, what are the tactics that we can wrap around that in terms of improving and creating efficiencies over time.
We're talking about reducing the stuff, but when companies take a look at FinOps and implementing the culture, do they look at the total cost of implementing it and say, nah, this is going to cost me more than what I really want to do to implement it?
Mm-hmm. I'm sure there's a lot of that out there. But again, if we start with customer, I think that can reset the conversation around what's important to focus on, number one. And then number two, we don't have to reinvent the wheel. As I started out, FinOps, the term is a new term for an old focus, right? It's finance, right? It's FP&A. It's understanding, what we're spending in the IT department, right? It's a little more laser focused, obviously, on cloud, but that dynamic and asset management, asset tracking, all of that's been around for years, right? So I would, advise that they look at what they're already doing, and they may have some really good operational efficiencies they've done on the prem or traditional data center or IT, and you can adopt that for cloud. So that would be kind of the first step in, is let's find small wins and let's wrap good culture around that, and let's focus on the end customer first. And then you can build off that platform into a broader and more comprehensive FinOps program.
In order to reduce the payback period, is there some automation, some tooling that can ultimately help you achieve these results?
Yeah. So automation is our friend, and automation can be a deterrent as well, right? If you put on your architect's hat or your site reliability engineer's hat or cloud engineer's hat, right? They want to keep things up. They're mandated. They have pressure points for service level agreements and even the customer in terms of what they need to deliver. And the finance is always looking for downward pressure on eliminating waste and cost, right? So when we look at those two dichotomies, it's really about understanding where automation makes sense, right? And you start with the customer, you start with the applications, you start with the data, and you say, does it rationally make sense that we would automate the optimization, let's say, of cloud spend? So maybe you're in the retail. So now let's get a little more specific. You're in the retail vertical, and you have seasonality, and you're going into the holiday season, right? And you have known shopping patterns, right? Automating, the bursting of that cloud makes a lot of sense, but optimizing it as you're elevating the capacity and the consumption that you're taking in, right? If you have mission critical applications in the healthcare vertical, right, you don't necessarily want to start automating things. Lives could be at stake, right? So you've got to be able to understand the context, the broader workload use case context for what you're doing with automation. As a general rule, it's like any technology. Is it good or is it bad? My answer is, how is it applied? How it's applied dictates whether it's going to be a good outcome or a bad one.
Your example of the automation and talking about it's just a new terminology for an old problem. Here's what I remember way back in the server days. We had our F5s, we were load balancing everything, and that was optimizing at that time, the load balance. Now when we're talking about, that is still an old problem that's relevant today, but using newer tools and technology to achieve that, serverless, always on smaller instances. Now you're implementing this new toolage, this new terminology, this new culture into it, and we're doing basically the FinOps method, right? And we're implementing it into the company.
Yeah, that's the journey. That's exactly right. And where you can optimize and leverage automation to better efficiency, you should. I'm just saying that there's always a precursor conversation that needs to happen. It's very contextual, and you need to understand and bridge those channels of communication first.
Well, Steve, what tools are out there? What is Hyperglance doing?
Yeah, Hyperglance, as I opened with, we are the FinOps tool for the cloud architect. And what I mean by that is there's a lot of platforms and tools out there that are very dashboard and orientation and budget driven in terms of orientation. We have those capabilities as well. But what we like to say at Hyperglance is we like to go drill down 3, 5, 7 layers into that dashboard and really get into things like tagging, reference architecture, diagramming, visualizations like Sankey diagrams, where you can drill down and get down to the line item billing level and understand where, what are my egress costs as an example. Putting cloud data into cloud is not expensive. Taking it out can be very expensive as an example. So we are, again, bridging those channels of communication. That's core to our platform, and enabling a visualization, a rules set, and an automation suite that the cloud architect and engineer can leverage with the FinOps organization. And we do basic reporting, dashboard reporting in addition to that, which you would see commonly in the market.
When you say bridging that, are you doing a collaboration not only with customers that you're working with? What does your collaboration methodology look like around the FinOps?
Yeah, I mean, it could be as tactical as workflows with upstream and downstream systems and API interfaces, and it can be as basic as an export button, right?
Oh, so you're doing collaboration within the tools, not just collaboration within the teams. You're actually hands-on working directly with them to collaborate with their existing tools and
the
methods?
The tools enable the organizational collaboration.
I like that. Nice. All right. So what else is Hyperglance doing around FinOps? I mean, help me understand the differentiating between all the other tools that are out there that can achieve some of the main purposes that you're trying to do within a company.
Right. So a lot of large cloud estates, right, are driven by application sets. And being able to isolate those applications and understand with tagging typically what it's really truly costing you. And there can be shared services. So doing chargeback and understanding those pieces, and then understanding the overall reference architecture that's wrapped around that, and having that deep conversation with the FinOps organization around transformational change or planning or immediate quick win cost takeout is what the tool enables. We also enable that through zero code query. So not to get too technical, but we have an ability, there isn't any programming. When we talk about the tie-in here would actually be the shortage of skills in the market right now. We all recognize there's a very acute shortage of skill sets out there. So bringing someone in and keeping them engaged in their job around this architecture concept with FinOps is very important. So if you can create a tool that makes their life easier, right, and makes their life more engaging and easier in terms of not having to code everything, where you can have a drag-drop environment and get to that answer very quickly, Hyperglance enables that. That's the intersection of Hyperglance.
I don't want to call you a tool. I want to call you a platform. And I think a tool is like maybe just one thing. I think you guys encompass a lot of things
Right.
that will help achieve the end results. When we're talking about implementing FinOps, are you helping customers implement it using your platform and then ultimately kind of pushing out and helping them understand how it works within the company and then stepping back and letting them run?
Yeah, so there's a couple deployment models and go-to-market models. One is channel partners and alliances. So for instance, we're partnered with technology optimization partners or TEMS, technology expense management partners, where they're looking at the entire life cycle of IT spend, from hardware, data center, the pipes going in and out of those data centers, cloud. And they're looking at it from asset tracking to contract management and full life cycle management. Well, part of that is cloud, right? So we engage in that level. The traditional MSP, I just got out of a public sector session here at the reInvent, where they were talking about, for every dollar of cloud consumption on AWS, there's $6.40 of MSP revenue, service revenue that can be pulled out of that, right? Cloud FinOps is a big part of that, and understanding how you can create advisory services, implementation services, et cetera. So our core is we write excellent software for the cloud engineer, cloud architect. That's our position in the ecosystem. Surrounding that is a great and powerful alliance and channel market of ecosystem of MSPs that deliver the services that you're suggesting in terms of implementation. The thing with Hyperglance, though, is we're up and running in 30 minutes.
That's it? That's all it takes?
That's all it takes on average. There can be some more complex environments a little longer, but on average, it's 30 minutes. It's time
That's
to value.
when I'm seeing possible results.
Correct. You can have a lit up dashboard, if you will, and the ability to deep query and create architecture diagrams in 30 minutes with the tool.
Okay, that's something I got to try out. Well, actually, speaking of,
Absolutely.
what does the future look like for Hyperglance?
Well, as top of mind for everyone, it's AI, right? And understanding where that makes sense, though, and where does that cross section of operational efficiency meet AI in terms of the business value, right? There is the technical value, but the business value, right? We don't want to necessarily make things, AI enabled if there isn't a business value attached to it, right? So we're building that into our horizon, into our roadmaps, and we're looking at different pieces. I'll just give you a little sneak peek. When we think about architecture reference architectures and diagrams. Well, what if you had a tool that would enable you to do what if scenarios, right? And what if scenarios down to the resource level within your cloud spend. So for instance, virtual machines or containers or databases or data stores. And I want to do it within those, you have different tiers and sizes, of course. Well, I have this application and I want it to have X performance, or maybe I want a little lower performance. And if I just click the button, what does that render in terms of the diagram and the cost and all those types of things? So back to that quadrant I talked about in terms of forward-looking planning, leveraging AI within Hyperglance for the idea of more efficient planning and more correlated planning.
There's no risk involved. It's what if. I mean, you can just kind of look at it and see where you can save a bunch of money, your costs implementing,
Right.
I like the FinOps methodology is not about saving money, it's about making money. And when people start realizing that, it's like, I'm not cutting costs. In fact, I want to grow my business. I'm going to take that and implement something else, do more R&D. Now, Steve, I got to wrap things up. How does one find more information on the payback period?
Yeah, on the payback period, just go out to hyperglance.com. We have an ROI calculator and tool. That looks different from an end customer enterprise or government perspective versus an MSP. An MSP is looking at that $6.40.
Yep.
That's great, but how do I do that profitably? So there's a little, variant to the ROI calculation. If you're an end enterprise and you're looking at implementing, a really solid channeled FinOps organization, and you want to implement a platform and kind of build it around a platform like Hyperglance, then we've got an ROI calculator, and that goes into hard payback periods as well as productivity gain around time and motion, around all these different task level things you need to do in terms of bridging those paths of communication between the architect and the FinOps org.
All right, you heard that. Go to Hyperglance for more information. Steve, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you, John. I appreciate it.
All right, this has been another awesome episode. Everybody, thank you for watching the Jon Myer podcast. As always, hit that like, subscribe, notify, because we're out of here.